Hi, this is to give you an idea of what you will find in each lesson of this French multimedia program. First, there's a vocabulary study in which you have a list of target vocabulary words in French with their English translations. Then there's a matching exercise where you match the French word to its English meaning to help you memorize this vocabulary. This is followed by a practice with a vocabulary where you are giving a complete sentence with a blank and several words. If you pick the correct word for the sentence, the whole sentence is going to be read to you. You will hear it in French. This is then followed by a series of verb study, and these verbs are then practiced in a series of exercises. Again, if you pick the right form of the verb or the information that is required from you, the whole sentence will be read to you. There are then two sets of exercises. There's an oral exercise where you will hear a short text in French and then you try to answer questions about it. And there's also a short text that you can read in French and you have to answer questions about this text too. My suggestion to you is that you may want to practice several times on a set of exercises just to make sure that you've acquired the information correctly, or go back to information that you've done for review, and I'm sure that this will help you practice. Bonjour. In this lesson, we're going to look at two things: the use of c'est versus the use of il est, and French descriptive adjectives. Let's start with c'est versus il est. The c'est part, you see, c'est can be used with a noun, or you can also use ce sont with a noun. The difference is this: you use c'est with a singular noun, and you use ce sont with a plural noun. So what I want you to remember is c'est used with a noun, because the contrast is that you use il est with an adjective. Okay? So for instance, il est grand, he's tall. Elle est grande, ils sont grands, elles sont grandes. And because I'm saying adjectives, I have to worry about the agreement of that adjective with the subject, feminine, plural, for instance. The minute, again, you hear the word adjective, you have to think in your mind agreement in gender and number of that adjective, here agreeing with the subject. Now, when it comes to nationality, profession, national origin, or religion, here's what happens. If you use c'est, for instance, as in c'est un étudiant, or if you use il est étudiant, you're basically saying the same thing. He is a student. The difference is this here. Here with c'est, I am using a noun. With il est, I know this is the same word, but this is considered to be an adjective. So you're still following the same rule that we've seen before, which is use c'est with a noun and use il est or ils sont with an adjective. All right. There is one important exception to this rule, which is c'est with a noun, il est with an adjective. And the rule, that exception is that you use c'est with an adjective if that adjective is masculine singular, nothing but masculine singular, and also if this represents a general idea. For instance, if you say le français c'est fantastique, you're saying French, it's fantastic. In that case, you're talking about French in a general way. It's a general idea, so you can use c'est with a masculine singular adjective. No other form of the adjective. All right. Contrast these two sentences, for instance. J'étudie le français. I study French. C'est intéressant. It's interesting. J'écoute le professeur. J'écoute le prof, short. Il est intéressant. You see the difference? In this case, this is a general idea, the say with the adjective. Here, I'm referring to somebody very specifically. I'm referring to le prof. C'est intéressant, general idea. Il est intéressant. He is interesting. For the second part of this lesson, we have descriptive adjectives. All right? Descriptive adjectives, as the name indicates, are used to describe. All right. Very important again. Always show the agreement in gender and number of the adjective with the noun it modifies. Always, always, always. For instance, I've taken a typical French adjective here. In a singular, in a plural, masculine, and feminine. If you start from the masculine singular, you make that masculine singular adjective feminine singular by adding an E. If you want to make the masculine singular adjective masculine plural, add an S. And if you want to make that masculine singular adjective feminine plural, add an E for the feminine and an S for the plural. Obviously, there are going to be exceptions. There are lists of adjectives that do not follow this simple pattern. They're available in your text files, and I suggest that you study those very carefully. What is the usual position of the adjective? The position is to be after the noun it modifies. Okay, for instance, you see un livre cher. That is the rule in French. And you've got to be careful about this because in English the tendency is to put the adjectives in front of the noun. All right. Here again I say exceptions. See, for instance, there's un beau livre, a beautiful book, which tells you that there are some adjectives in French that can be placed in front of the noun they modify. Again, there is a list for these. I suggest that you study them very carefully. There's also a list of adjectives that can be placed either in front of the noun or after the noun, and depending on the position they have in comparison to the noun, their meaning will change. Bonjour. In this lesson, we're going to look at three different things. We're going to look at demonstrative adjectives, we're going to look at possessive adjectives, and we're going to look at how to tell time in French. If we start with the demonstrative adjectives, first in the word demonstrative, you have the idea of showing, pointing to, and if we say adjectives, immediately you think about an agreement. Here are your forms. In the singular, in the plural, masculine and feminine. There are two forms as you see in the masculine singular. You se when it's followed by a noun beginning with a consonant, and you set when it's followed by a noun beginning with a mute H or a vowel. This set here is pronounced the same as the feminine form, set. All these forms have one common form in the plural, se. Now sometimes you have to worry about contrasting. For instance, when you're saying this table as opposed to that table. The way you do this is the following. You add after the noun hyphen and si, or hyphen and la. What's the difference? Use this to say this book, and use this one to say that book. So you see the way to remember this is in si you have the vowel I, just like you have in this. In la you have the vowel a, the same that you have in that. In the plural, obviously they correspond, and this, these, that, those, and you notice that you don't need to add an S to si and la, only to the noun. All right, let's look now at possessive adjectives. Now, possessive adjective implied possession, ownership. Again, the word adjective, which means that you have to worry about the agreement in gender and number with a noun this possessive adjective works with. All right? This means masculine singular, masculine and feminine plural, because the forms are the same. All right? Here they are. Corresponding to my in English, mon, ma, mes. Corresponding to your familiar in English, ton, ta, te. Corresponding to his or her, and we'll get back to this in a second, son, sa, se. Corresponding to our, notre, nos. Corresponding to your, formal this time, votre, vos. And corresponding to their, leur, and leur. All right? You use these forms with a masculine singular noun, those with a feminine singular noun, and you use these with either a masculine or a feminine plural noun. As I said, we'll get back to something, and here it is. In English, you have to express, for instance, her book or his book. Okay? Well, in French, you don't have to worry about her or his because, don't forget, this is called a possessive adjective, which means that if you want to say her book, you will say son livre. If you want to say his book, you will say son livre also, because what's important is that livre is masculine singular, not that the fact that the book belongs to her or to him. Okay? So always look to the gender and the number of a noun to choose your possessive adjective, not to what the English sentence tells you, because that is not the way French functions. All right? Now, sometimes in French, as is the case here, you have feminine singular nouns that begin either with a vowel or a mute H. And you have to be careful about those because they would use the forms, for instance, ma, ta, or sa. When you do that, though, the ma followed by o, or the ta followed by e, or the sa followed by o, that makes sounds that are difficult to hear. And so French prefers to, and you must do that, replace the ma, ta, sa by mon, ton, son. That way you can use the N for linkage in the pronunciation and say mon auto, ton histoire, son eau. It doesn't mean that the word has changed gender or anything. It's just giving you a tool that makes it easier to pronounce these words. And that's the only idea. All right. Telling time in French. How do you tell time? Well, if you want to know what time it is, you just ask the question, quelle heure est-il? All right. You notice in the question you have est-il, is it? That is what you use in your answer. For instance, il est 1h10 or il est 7h24. You notice now that I have an S for the word hour because there's more than 1 hour. Here's another example. Il est 8h moins 5. So it's 8 o'clock minus 5, or if you prefer, it's 7:55. All right? Do you notice that systematically in French, the number for the hour is always before the number for the minutes? It's not the same in English, but in French, you don't have that luxury. The number for the hours is always in front of the number for the hours, and you cannot change that order. All right? Specific times. Il est 2h15. It's 2:15, or it's 2:15. Il est 1h30. It's 2:30, or it's 2:30. Il est 1h15. It's 1:45, or it's 1:45. All right? Now, sometimes in Europe and in French, you have to use the 24-hour clock. For instance, 18 hours, 18 heures, that means 6 heures du soir, 6 of the evening, 6 p.m. The way to do this is that you add 12 to a number, or you remove 12 from the number, and you see 18 minus 12 is 6, so 18 hours at 6 p.m., okay? Other specific time, a time in the morning, you would add du matin. For instance, il est 2 heures du matin, it's 2 a.m., or de l'après-midi, il est 3 heures de l'après-midi, it's 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Bonjour. In this lesson, we're going to look at three things: partitive articles, quantities, and negations. Let's look with the partitive articles. Partitive has the word part in it, and that is a hint to you that you use the partitive articles when you want to express some. For instance, some water. In the singular, the forms are for the masculine du, or de l'apostrophe followed by a vowel or a mute H, and in the feminine, de la, or de l'apostrophe, for the same reason, a word that begins with a vowel or a mute H. For instance, if you say some milk, du lait, some water, de l'eau. Use these partitives with non-countables. Okay? Here are some more. For instance, see the difference between je mange le gâteau et je mange du gâteau. I eat the cake, I eat some cake. In the first case, you eat the whole cake. In the second case, you only eat a piece of the cake. All right? In a negative construction, something interesting happens. Je ne mange pas de tarte. I do not eat any pie. All right? What has happened to the partitive in a negative construction is that the article has disappeared. The part of the article has disappeared. Now, instead of having du, as you had here, you have de, for instance. Or de la would also become de. All right? So anytime you have a partitive in a negative construction, ne, pas, de. No article expressed. Okay? But if you use the verb to be, that rule does not apply. See, if I'm saying ce n'est pas du pain, this is not bread, well, I can still use the partitive du. Du, which is a combination of de and le. You never find de and le together in French. They're always du. Let's look at quantities now. Quantities can be of two types. For instance, one can be obvious things like beaucoup, a lot, un peu, a little, or things are maybe a little more difficult to figure out. For instance, when you see un verre de, a glass of, that is a quantity too. All right? I've given you some senses here. Je bois du lait. Okay, I've got the partitive. I drink some milk. In the negative, you know, je ne bois pas de lait, because it's a negative construction. For instance, here now, je bois un peu de lait. I drink a little milk. So see, with a quantity, you use de and nothing else. The same thing that you would do in English. I drink a little glass of milk, for instance. And if you had a negative construction along with a quantity, see, ne pas. With a quantity beaucoup, the same thing would happen. You would use de instead of du or de la. All right? Negations. Negations we've used to change the meaning of a sentence. Je regarde, I watch. Je ne regarde pas, I do not watch. Ne is common to all the negations in French. Pas is the more common one of them, and it comes after the conjugated verb. Ne in front, pas after. Here's another case. We've got a construction here with the futur proche, the near future. Il va parler. He's going to speak. Well, this is the conjugated verb right here. So if I make the sentence negative, I will say il ne va pas parler. He is not going to speak. And you see the negation goes around the conjugated verb. All right? Now, if you want to use negations in a question, for instance, Sarah n'aime-t-elle pas le film? Doesn't Sarah like the film? Well, what happens here? The ne of the negation has become an apostrophe because it's followed by a vowel. Then I have that T that is there for pronunciation's sake, the subject pronoun, and then pas follows because that's the only place where you can put the pas. I cannot put it right after the verb here because when you have an inversion, the combination of the verb form and the subject pronoun, it's almost like something that is linked with a chain, and you cannot separate it. So you have to put the second part of the negation in the next available spot, which is usually after the subject pronoun. Bonjour. In this lesson, we're going to look at two things, the comparative and the superlative of adjectives. Let's start with the comparative. As the name indicates, this allows you to compare, okay? Here are the constructions in French. Plus with an adjective que, more adjective than, moins with an adjective que, less adjective than, and then aussi with an adjective que, as adjective as. So first thing that you notice is that in English, where you say than or as, the same word is used in French. Que. Adjective, agreement, agreement. So never forget to, whenever you hear the word adjective or you know you're using an adjective, to make sure that adjective agrees with a noun in gender and number. For instance, elle est plus grande qu'Henri. All right? Elle, the subject, is feminine singular. The adjective here then is feminine singular too. In English, you have two constructions for the comparatives. You can say more interesting than, or you can say greater than. In French, there's only one construction, the construction where you use more, less, or as. There is no equivalent to, for instance, the greater, adding an ER to an adjective. That doesn't exist in French. This is the way regular adjectives work. Obviously, there are some irregular adjectives, and for those, you can't use plus que, moins que, etc. You just use a different form. For instance, here's the adjective bon, good in all its forms, and in the comparative, bon becomes meilleur. Bonne becomes meilleur. Different spelling, same pronunciation. In the plural, bon, meilleur, bonne, meilleur. Still the same pronunciation, but different spelling. Other adjectives that do the same thing are mauvais, bad, and petit, small. Let's talk about the superlatives now. Superlative shows you that something is superior. Okay? And in order to do that, you use a definite article followed by plus and the adjective, or the definite article followed by moins plus the adjective. Use this if you want to say the most. Use that if you want to say the least. Sometimes you have to express in the notion of in the. And the way to do that is not to use dans, but to use de. De combined with a definite article. So if it's the form of the definite article in the masculine singular, this combines into du. De followed by la doesn't change. De followed by L apostrophe doesn't change. De is the contraction of de followed by le. So that's what you would use to express in the. All right? Now, there's some adjectives that go in front, in French, in front of the noun. Very few of them. The majority of the adjectives go after the noun. Where do you place the superlatives? Well, you should place it as a rule where you would put the adjective in its non-superlative form. For instance, here I have an adjective that is usually after the noun, so this is where I've placed my superlative. Le livre le plus cher. Now, on the other hand, in this case, I'm using an adjective which is usually used in front of the noun, so that is where I've placed the superlative, la plus grande ville. All right? In this case here, le livre le plus cher, this translates as the most expensive book. When the noun precedes the superlative, you notice that the noun has its article and the superlative has its article. The article is expressed twice. But in the case of the superlative coming before the noun, well, in that case, the superlative and the noun share the same article. Bonjour. In this lesson, we're going to look at three things. We're going to look at reflexive verbs, imperatives, and how to tell the date in French. Let's start with the reflexive verbs. Reflexive verbs are recognizable in their infinitive form because the infinitive always starts with se. Se laver, to wash oneself. If you remove the se, then it becomes the verb laver, to wash. What is a reflexive verb? Well, I wash myself is a perfect example. The subject, I, performs the action of washing on itself. I wash myself. That is a reflexive verb. In French, you would express it in the following manner. Je me lave. I wash myself. Negatively, je ne me lave pas. All right. Here's a very important point to remember, that whenever you have the ne of the negation and a pronoun, the ne always comes before the pronoun. Just try to remember it as in the following fashion, that in the alphabet, the N comes before the P of pronoun, so therefore you always put the ne in front of whatever pronoun you have in your sentence. Here is a conjugation of a reflexive verb. And it is reflexive because I have these pairs established. Je me, I myself, tu te, you yourself, il se, he himself, etc., etc. Let's do this in French. Je me lave, tu te laves, il se lave, nous nous lavons, vous vous lavez, il se lave. All right? If I combine things in any other forms that the pairs that I have here, it is no longer a reflexive verb because the subject would not be performing the action on itself. All right? As a question, se lave-t-il? Do they wash themselves? The pronoun is in front of the verb form. Or negatively, ne se lave-t-il pas? And again, the negation comes before the pronoun. Two important lessons from those two senses. It's okay in French to start a question with a pronoun, and it's okay in French to start a negative question by the negation. There is nothing wrong with that. Let's look at the imperatives. Imperatives is when you give people commands, when you tell people close the door, open your book, etc., etc. All right. The conjugation of verbs in the imperatives are quite simple. First of all, there is no subject expressed. Okay? You say, eat your soup, drink your milk. Okay? The conjugation is based on the conjugation of the verb in the present tense. So if you know your conjugations in the present tense, you will have no problem conjugating verbs in the imperative. Imperatives are only used for three persons of the conjugation. Second person singular, first person plural, second person plural. All right? The conjugation is the same as the conjugation of the verbs in the present tense, except for ER verbs. The first group verbs, you notice here, if it were the present tense, I would have an S here. There is no S when you conjugate an ER verb in the imperative. Otherwise, everything is the same as what you've learned for the present tense. For instance, mange, mangeons, manger. Eat, let's eat, eat. Mange is informal, manger is formal. Fini, finissons, finissez. Finish, let us finish, finish. Informal, formal. Vend, vendons, vendez. Sell, let's sell, sell. Informal, formal. That's the way most of the French verbs function. There are few verbs that have irregular forms in the imperative. And here are three examples. The verb avoir, to have, être, to be, savoir, to know. And these are their forms in the imperative. Est, ayons, ayez. Sois, soyons, soyez. Sache, sachons, sachez. All right. What about the imperative of reflexive verbs? Well, here's a couple of senses here. Reposez-vous. Reposez-vous, the verb form with a reflexive pronoun. This is not a question. There is no question mark at the end. This is the verb in the imperative followed by the reflexive pronoun. Rest yourselves. Okay? You notice that the pronoun comes after the verb form. But if I use this construction negatively, ne vous reposez pas. Do not rest yourselves. All right. This construction right here in the affirmative imperative, where you find the pronoun after the verb, that is the only construction where you will find a pronoun coming after a verb form. And now, you want to know what the date is. The simple question to ask in French is, quelle est la date? What is the date? Okay? Now, in French, the date is always expressed in that order. The day before the month before the year. In English, you can express a date different ways, but this is the way you have to do it in French. The day followed by the month followed by the year. For instance, c'est le 29 avril 1952. All right? The day comes before the month, comes before the year. You notice something else. There is nothing in between these words. There are no commas. There is no de, nothing. Also, the thing that you need to know is that you never capitalize the month in a French date. You do that in English, but you don't do that in French. All right. A couple of other little things. The numbers that you use in a date in French are cardinal numbers, meaning 10, 11, 12. And for instance, when I say this number, it's le 10 mai. Okay? The only time you use an ordinal number in a French date is when you express the first day of the month. For instance, the 1st of April, 1er avril. And the one with a little ER stands for premier, first. Okay? So use an ordinal number as you do in English for the first day of the month, but after that you use cardinal number. And that's different from what you do in English. All right? If you don't want to ask what the date is, you just want to know what day of the week it is, then you ask the question, quel jour sommes-nous? What day are we? And then you would get the answer. For instance, c'est lundi. It's Monday. If you see in the text something like le mardi, that refers specifically to the following, that you're talking about all the Tuesdays are coming. If you're saying, I'm going to the movies on Tuesdays, then you would say le mardi. If you're just going to the movies next Tuesday, then you will say mardi.